When we discussed the process of structural adjustment earlier in the course, we noticed that it often generated considerable local resentment and protest. Usually, protesters were responding to the withdrawal of state services from sectors in which the state had historically been responsible for the provision of basic services like water and sanitation. Today, we'll look at the specific example of South Africa and local responses there to the privatization of basic service delivery. While privatization of state services has been a general trend across the developing world, the commodification of basic services in South Africa was aided by what Patrick Bond labels the technologies of neoliberalism. This included most dramatically the introduction of prepaid meters for water and electricity. These meters required users to prepay for water and electricity on a debit card. The meters automatically cut off services after those cards were exhausted. The meter, as South African scholar Prashani Naidu observes, removes any responsibility for service delivery from the state and the private sector provider, making the individual responsible for gaining access to basic services. Further, prepaid meters undermined collective acts of resistance and individualized the process of securing the resources necessary for life. Collective political demands for water, electricity, housing, healthcare, and other basic social services are, as Naidu concludes, converted into individualized bureaucratic arrangements, forcing individuals into binding technical agreements that erase the politics. But the technologies are part of a broader retreat from the state that has generated a strong spirit of activism, particularly among South Africa's poor. Remembering that South Africa's transition from apartheid occurred less than a generation ago, that spirit of activism has brought down apartheid continues. Anti-privatization struggles erupted across South Africa in response to the retreat of the state. The collective identities of the poors served as a new form of social mobilization, supplementing the racial and gender dynamics of exclusion that characterized the apartheid system and the post-apartheid South Africa. As Ashwin Desai put it, beginning in the anti-eviction struggles in Chatsworth, identities were being rethought in the context of struggle, and the bearer of these identities were no respecters of authority. The particular kind of identity congealing in this moment had no grand ideological preconditions, and so could not be co-opted by government sloganeering. It was organized primarily around the relation of resistance that had to be offered against the hostilities being visited on the poor. From Chatsworth to Soweto, from Khayelitsha to Tafelsig, from Orange Farm to Kennedy Road, the poors in South Africa continued to resist the commodification of social reproduction under neoliberalism. Opposition to privatization has become, in short, the focus of a new struggle for poor South Africans. In general, a twin strategy has been deployed. On the one hand, individuals and groups have used the courts to secure basic individual rights and to force the state to provide certain social services. On the other hand, anti-privatization activists often view the court with suspicion, contending that the rights-based approach on which they are predicated undermine the possibility of collective resistance and reinforce rather than challenge neoliberalization in South Africa. Instead, they advocate a commons-based approach which rests on the rejection of privatization entirely and instead attempts to reassert collective control and community rights, which has come to define much of the anti-privatization work. A powerful example of the courts-based approach, albeit one which was backed by popular resistance, is provided by South Africa's Treatment Action Campaign, or TAC, which successfully used the courts to compel the South African government to provide free antiretroviral treatment for all HIV-positive South Africans, claiming that the South African government was undermining the constitutional right to health. The TAC's victory forced the South African government and a reluctant Thabo Mbeki to initiate programs to provide treatment. When transnational pharmaceutical companies sued South Africa to prevent the program from coming into being, the TAC then allied with the South African government to defend South Africa's right to produce generic medicines, reducing the cost of treatment from $10,000 per patient per year to $600 per patient per year. At the same time, the anti-privatization activists have pushed for a more radical approach intended to recommon the commons. In 2002, a 10 Rand campaign was launched in Durban. Protesters marched on municipal offices, demanding to pay back rent on matchbox houses owned by the city government. From their perspective, 10 Rand was a fair price to pay for monthly services. They also demanded that 10 Rand settle all arrears that the government claimed. Similar marches were soon mobilized in other South African cities, and this campaign echoed demands for just prices by British peasants during the transition to capitalism and its effort to establish a moral economy. Throughout the early 2000s, struggles over housing, access to water, and particularly access to electricity emerged as a central point of struggle in South Africa. Having been faced with little access to grid power under apartheid, residents of the former townships demanded electricity delivery from the state. Initially, the state responded by rolling out power. However, as the mantra of full cost recovery gained traction, poorer residents of Soweto and other areas quickly found themselves owing huge arrears and their power was cut off. Residents complained on two grounds. First, that the price charged for electricity was too high, and second, that the South African Constitution afforded a right to a basic lifeline of electricity just as it did water. I'll return to the first point shortly, but on the second point, the South African government was unmoved. Eskom, the South African electricity company, continued its disconnections. Even if they were able to pay their arrears, residents of poor South African settlements could not afford the reconnection fee, which often amounted to more than 6 months' salary. In response, they launched the Soweto Electricity Crisis Commission, or SECC. The SECC trained community electricians who would reconnect power to households disconnected earlier, a program they referred to as Operation Kainisa, to light. However, this soon sparked an arms race as Eskom shrunk electricity boxes to make reconnection more difficult and more deadly, as touching a live wire to the metal side of the box could result in fatal electrocution. Differential electricity pricing, again part of full cost recovery, meant that residents of poorer areas of large cities were counterintuitively often charged more for their electricity. In Soweto, for example, customers were charged 28 cents per kilowatt unit. Meanwhile, residents of the wealthy Sandton region, located less than 30 miles away, paid just 16 cents per unit. South Africa's energy-intensive mining industries paid 7 cents per unit, while the poorest rural regions, those fortunate few to have access to grid power, paid 48 cents. The South African government attempted to portray resistance to privatization of electricity, housing, and water as a culture of non-payment. They even launched a campaign known as the Maskahane campaign, meaning we're in this together, to convince residents to pay for their service fees. While non-payment certainly was, and I would argue continues to be, a symbolic statement of resistance originally associated with the anti-apartheid movement and later with the anti-privatization movement, the decision not to pay is not always a voluntary one. As Desai concludes, contrary to government accusations, there was no culture of non-payment. There was simply no income in these areas. What had taken root was an economics of non-payment. Throughout all the areas of struggle focused on reclaiming the commons, women played a central role. The reason is clear. Who walks for water when it's not delivered? Who boils the water so it's safe to drink? Who collects the firewood necessary to boil the water? Who takes care of the ill when the family falls sick from contaminated water? Universally, the commodification of basic services undermines the position of women, foisting a greater workload on their already overburdened shoulders. Perhaps the clearest example of this is the deployment of shallow sewers, one of the key technologies of neoliberalism in South Africa. Prepaid meters govern access to water and electricity. Shallow sewers are thin pipes that connect the household cisterns to municipal sewer lines. These pipes are buried at low depths and have regular hatches which provide open access to the line. The low water flow necessitated by water commodification and the use of prepaid meters means that these sewer lines easily and regularly clog or are blocked. An instruction sheet is provided to all households outlining maintenance procedures, which require the member of a household, usually a woman, to clear the pipe by a hopefully gloved hand. The opposition movement was also driven by the country's vibrant civil society. Civil society refers to the realm of public life and collective action outside the state and the economy. Durban, South Africa's second largest city, boasts a vibrant civil society. South Africa's shack dwellers movement, with an estimated 10,000 members, originated in Durban and is pictured here at a rally on Kennedy Road. Neighborhoods in various Durban suburbs, including Chatsworth, Clarewood, and others, field strong community organizations. However, civil society is not always progressive, and in recent years, Durban has come under criticism for the government's poor treatment of residents in informal settlements across the city. Home to an estimated 800,000 residents, these informal settlements have developed as part of the massive housing backlog in the city. Residents of informal settlements often live in crowded conditions without the benefit of basic services like water and electricity. Fire is a constant risk, as the outbreak of the Fury Fire, which sparked the Right to Water lawsuit in Johannesburg, demonstrates. Social problems, including incidents of HIV/AIDS and increased risk of crime, are also prevalent. Further, as the South African economy has deteriorated in recent years, frustration in informal settlements has sometimes boiled over into xenophobic violence. This violence is directed particularly at Mozambicans, Somalis, Zimbabweans, and Nigerians, who are accused of taking jobs and services that would otherwise belong to South Africans. Xenophobic violence has broken out sporadically in the post-apartheid era. In May 2008, however, widespread riots began in Alexandra, Johannesburg, and spread to informal settlements across the country. Nevertheless, the mobilization of such strong community resistance fuels the creation of alternative visions of development and social progress, which will be the focus of the final week of the course.